Welcome again to the Menagiér to Downham Market. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about sauces and sauce makers. Now, there are actually lots of recipes in the literature for sauces. Many of them actually hide as recipes for roasts because the roasting itself was an understood technique, often a specialist's technique. So the recipes for roasts are often actually the recipe for the accompanying sauce. So for instance, in Menagiér de Paris itself, we find things like a recipe for kids or lambs, which says simply toss into boiling water just briefly, brown on the spit, then roast and eat with cameline sauce. You find that sort of thing in a lot of the recipes. Now, the fact that it says eat with cameline sauce is actually a very interesting point because saucemaker was a specialist craft. In an urban environment, you had a lot of people who were involved in the process of provisioning the city. Not only did you have the ingredient purveyors, the butchers, the poulterers, the fishmongers, that sort of thing. You had those who were providing prepared foods, bakers, obviously, brewers, the cooks. There was a class of professional cooks running cook shops. That's extremely well documented, in England at least, but also in other places. And you had specialist sauce makers. Going back to Menagiér de Paris, in a section where he's talking and telling his wife, his young wife, about where she should go when she's preparing for the food, she suggests you should go to the sauce maker to buy 3 pints of cameline for dinner and a half a gallon of sorrel vert juice. So in this case, you could make your own cameline sauce, and there are recipes for it. But if you were living in a medieval urban environment, you might very well just go and buy it from the sauce maker. And there were quite a few sauce makers. Well, but it was a specialist craft and tended to be a little bit higher prestige than your average cook shop owner. So for instance, in the years 1390 to 1500, between those years, in the city of York, there were 115 people who took up the franchise, who became freemen of York, citizens of York. 115 were cooks, and there were 18 sauce makers. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell us anything, that's just the relative frequency of it. However, over the same time period, we have 9 surviving wills for the cooks, but also 9 surviving wills for the sauce makers. And at this time period, having a will and paying to have it enrolled suggests that you had a little bit of money. It's not 100%, of course, but it is an indicator that of some sort of financial status. So the fact that 1 out of 2 sauce makers has a will in the register, whereas only 1 out of every 10, 12, 14, something in that neighborhood, of the cooks does, suggests that on balance, the sauce makers were a little bit better off. Now we have other references that might suggest that that's not always the case, of course. In Norwich, in 1570, for instance, there are a couple of references to people who sell sauce makers. One is a butcher's wife. The butcher is working as a butcher, and his wife also sells sauce on the side. And there's also, at the same time, and in the same parish, in fact, a widow who sells sauce, but also teaches children. They're both listed as very poor. So it's not 100%, of course. Then you also find sort of interesting other references to things about the sauce. For instance, in Nottingham, around 1400, one of the bailiffs was a man named Richard Vertsauce, Richard Greensauce. And clearly he was, in the city hierarchy. He was working as a bailiff. Was he also in private life a sauce maker? Or did he have sauce makers in his ancestry? Who knows? But the name is suggestive. Now, the sauce makers, we saw that in Paris in about 1390-ish, the sauce makers were selling the cameline sauce and sorrel verjuice. Now, verjuice is sharp. It's like a vinegar. It's the juice of unripe grapes, generally, is what it's considered to be. But it's sharp. It's bitey. But in York, around 1301, there's a set of Civic Ordinances which give us a little bit more information as well about the sauces. And from the York sauce makers, you could get ginger sauce, galantine sauce, the green sauce about which we were talking, and mustard. So if you're in an urban environment, you could certainly make your own sauces, and there are recipes for it. Or if you had a little bit of money and a little bit less time, perhaps, you could go and buy it from the specialist sauce makers. Now, for the kitchen today, I'm going to make a sauce, but it's not actually a medieval sauce. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a flour thickened sauce, which is not a technique which shows up in medieval cookery, at least not in any place where I can find it easily, and nothing comes to my mind about it. Bread thickened sauces, breadcrumb thickened sauces, certainly, but flour thickened sauces like we use a lot in modern cookery, not so much. But I cook with them a lot, and perhaps you will find my hints on how to make a flour thickened sauce or a gravy to be helpful. So let's go to the kitchen. So this is going to be making more or less a standard bechamel. The technique, however, is typical for any sort of flour thickened gravy or sauce. So get the oil going without whatever that is in it. Now what I'm making is a pretty strong and salty garlic bechamel, because that's what's going in my meal tonight. The main trick with all of this, however, is to make sure that the water doesn't get added until after the flour has been added and cooked a little bit. It really doesn't take very long. I've got my oil nice and hot, my garlic and some salt cooking in there. Smells fantastic because, of course, sauteing garlic is one of the great things in the world. Just get that a little cooked with a little bit of the salt and a little bit of color on it. Got it nice and high heat, so you can see that that's cooking pretty fast. But take the heat down a little bit and add the flour. I always just try to eyeball it. But the more flour you add, the thicker the gravy is going to be. So that's a couple of tablespoons of flour. And then you got to stir it around to make sure that the flour is thoroughly mixed in. Now for a traditional bechamel or a traditional roux, you probably wouldn't have the garlic and stuff in now, but it doesn't matter a whole lot. Then you just let the flour cook a little bit. And the longer you cook the flour, the darker your sauce will be. For Cajun cooking, or any cooking where you've got a roux, the longer you cook it, the blacker it gets and the darker the sauce. I don't need a particularly dark sauce. So I just want to make sure that my flour has gotten a little bit of the raw taste out, and most importantly, has been thoroughly mixed in with the oil. Then you add your liquid. I use heavy cream because I like heavy cream. But you can use any liquid. Milk is traditional, but you can use broth. If you're making a gravy from a roast, you could use some of the broth from that if you wanted. And then you just stir it. And as long as the flour has been thoroughly cooked and thoroughly mixed in with the oil, you're not going to get lumps.
you get lumps when the flour has clumped, when the liquid goes in too soon. As you can see, there's no lumps there. All the little clumps are garlic. Then you have to bring it up to heat, because for it to really fully thicken, you need to actually get it to a simmer. I'm stirring because I don't want it to burn on the bottom. You can see it's just there. And for my purposes, that's it. And you can see it's thickening up quite nicely. That's it. That's the bechamel.